Welcome back to the Pointe podcast. I'm back in the driver's seat again here after missing last week's episode. And main reason is I wasn't feeling well, but it's great to be back and to have a couple of new guests here with us. One of the guests who will also be kind of co-piloting with me is Scott Hoffman, and he is a fellow colleague of mine. He's an integral part of the Big Picture program here at NorthPointe Christian. And in my experience with Scott, a deep thinker who invests himself into the shaping of students here at NorthPointe Christian. And he'll ask some really deep questions and maybe some that I'll have to unpack a little bit. And if I can't, then I'll just make some things up. Okay. Joel Shaffer is our guest today, and he's the Executive Director of Urban Transformation Ministries, UTM. He's a fellow Hoosier.
I am.
From Indiana. And Joel and I have known each other for, 30 years maybe?
Something like that,
Quite a long time. Mm-hmm. By the way, Hoosier, what does it mean?
Oh, gosh.
Have any idea where that comes from?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of theories. I don't know. I mean, you put me on the spot about Hoosiers. I wasn't wasn't ready for that. So
I heard it was because of our drawl.
Yeah.
That when someone comes to the door, we say Hoosier.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard, and that to me has been probably the most sound explanation.
It's a lot better than what I've heard. Where there's a lot of because a lot of people from Kentucky, a lot of hillbillies, that came to have come over across to Indiana, and then a lot of fighting and a lot of things like that, and then after one thing, it was like person lost their ear, whose ear? I've heard that.
I've heard that. I also heard that there was a war between Kentucky and Indiana, and Kentucky would throw dynamite over in Indiana, and Indiana would light them and throw them back.
That could be. I mean, that's the way some of the basketball games between Indiana and Kentucky are. They're pretty explosive.
And speaking of Indiana, the Hoosiers, I know Mike Woodson has been on the hot seat, and now it looks like at the end of the season he'll be stepping down. Yeah. And Dusty May will be stepping in.
We'll see.
All you Michigan fans out there, we're going to have a... Hopefully.
We'll see. We'll see what happens.
He's from my neck of the woods. Actually, the basketball conference that I was in, he was in that same conference, but he came along a little bit later than I did.
Yeah.
So.
Welcome to the Pointe podcast. The Pointe is brought to you by NorthPointe's Bible Department as an outreach for NorthPointe Christian Schools and for outside listeners curious to know more about the grand story of God and the Bible. We're so glad you joined us. So let's just get to the point.
Back to Joel. Anyway, he's been an important part of our MPC community here in various roles. Your wife used to be on staff here, and all of your kids have gone to school here.
Yes.
And currently I have Sahara in class.
It's Sahara.
Sahara. So I want to talk a little bit, or we want to talk a little bit about biblical justice and other things, and eventually get to UTM and what you're doing with that and how important it is. I want to talk about first 3 Tims that have kind of shaped my thinking when it comes to justice. The first is Tim Keller, and we'll read a little bit from this book, Generous Justice, how God's grace makes us just. Another one, and you wouldn't think this, but is Tim Tebow. And I think because of his platform, and you're a big football guy, your son Jalen played football there at Wheaton, was a standout there at Wheaton. Yeah. But Tim Tebow, I think, has expanded justice in the secular world from the progressive, just kind of focusing on whether it be black and brown or LGBTQ or whatever, to abortion, to human trafficking, his Night to Shine stuff that he does with people with developmental disabilities, and just I think a fantastic example. And he's out on the main stage where everybody can see him. There's a whole lot that he does out there that I think impacting the world for Jesus Christ. So that's my second Tim. My third Tim really is a guy named Tim Mackey. And Tim Mackey is the guy who kind of started the Bible Projects.
Oh, yeah.
And if you've seen these Bible Projects, they're excellent. I really highly recommend them. They are free on YouTube. Let's take a watch of this clip of the Bible Project on justice.
If you were a praying mantis, it would be socially acceptable to devour your mate.
And if you're a honey badger, you have no regard for other animals. You don't care.
If you're a panda with twins, it's normal to abandon one to take care of the other.
But if humans do any of these things, we would call it wrong, unfair, or unjust.
Yeah, why is that? Why do humans care so much about justice?
Well, the Bible has a fascinating response to that question. On page 1, humans are set apart from all other creatures as the image of God.
Yeah, God's representatives who rule the world by his definition of good and evil.
And this identity, it's the bedrock of the Bible's view of justice. All humans are equal before God and have the right to be treated with dignity and fairness no matter who you are.
And that would be nice if we all did that. But we know how the world really works.
And the Bible addresses that too. It shows how we are constantly redefining good and evil to our own advantage at the expense of others.
Yeah, self-preservation. And the weaker someone is, the easier it is to take advantage of them.
And so in the biblical story, we see this happening on a personal level, but also in families, and then in communities, and in whole civilizations that create injustice, especially towards the vulnerable. But the story doesn't end there. Out of this whole mess, God chose a man named Abraham to start a new kind of family. Specifically, Abraham was to teach his family to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice.
Yeah, doing righteousness, that's a Bible word I don't really use, but what comes to mind is being a good person.
But what does that even mean, being good? The biblical Hebrew word for righteousness is tzedakah, and it's more specific. It's an ethical standard that refers to right relationships between people. It's about treating others as the image of God,
with the God-given dignity they deserve.
And this word justice, it's the Hebrew word mishpat. It can refer to retributive justice.
Like if I steal something, I pay the consequences.
Exactly. Yet most often in the Bible, mishpat refers to restorative justice. It means going a step further, actually seeking out vulnerable people who are being taken advantage of and helping them.
Yeah, some people call this charity.
But mishpat involves way more. It means taking steps to advocate for the vulnerable and changing social structures to prevent injustice.
So justice and righteousness are about a radical, selfless way of life.
Yeah, and you find this idea all over the Bible.
I do want to read an excerpt from Mike Whitmer's book. And Mike Whitmer has a chapter in his Urban Legends. He was a former guest a couple of times ago. And so Mike and we sat down and talked a bit. But here in his chapter that is entitled, "We Must Preach the Gospel at All Times, If Necessary, Use Words," he says this. And this is the phrase that he's going after. Evangelism distracts from social justice. He says, progressive churchgoers warn that conservative Christians, concerned to tell others that Jesus died for their sin, prevents them from joining the fight for racial, sexual, and economic justice. We are so focused on avoiding everlasting damnation in hell that we neglect to help victims escape their present suffering on earth. I expect many Christians feel this tension to some extent. We are finite people with limited resources, and it's hard to care for a person's spiritual and physical needs at the same time. At any given moment, we may be leading a Bible study or stocking a food pantry, but not both. I appreciate how one Christian ministry expresses the tension. It says evangelism and justice are two sides of the same coin, and we must continually flip the coin. It was Christians who led the fight to end slavery. This is not a cure-all as Christians remain sinners, but the best way to improve justice in your own town is to bring people to Jesus and to teach them his ways. All right. So first of all, before we start to kind of comment on what Mike Whitmer has said here or written in his book, what's your experience with Mike Whitmer? How do you know Mike? Mike and I have known each other for 30 years. How do you know Mike?
Well, Mike was a fellow student with me at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. We were in a class together. I think it was in 1992. I believe it was 1992, 93, right around there. You know, for me, it took me 16 years to get through seminary.
Okay.
I was just taking
You were on the short track.
Taking a class one at a time. This is before they had the urban cohort where they could just go really fast for that. But then by 1997, he was my teacher. He was my professor. And I remember him coming in for It was a class called Theology of Culture. Dr. Greer taught the first half, and the second half was a missions prof by the name of Dr. Beals. Well, Dr. Beals, I think, had a heart attack, and so to come in, Dr. or I don't know if he was a doctor at that point, but anyways, he came in to fill in, and Mike, he'd also been a missionary to China, so he had some cross-cultural experience as well, and so he did a really good job. I mean, in that theology of culture class,
and this was in 1997.
1997, and then I had him, I think, again for a theology for one of the theology classes, and then there was another class that I had him, and then he was one of my professors for when I did my thesis. He was one of the ones that oversaw that process.
And what was the title of that thesis again?
Gosh, I have to look it up.
Here, I wrote it down.
Thank you very much.
The title of the thesis is An Uneasy Missional Relationship, Helping Resolve the Tension Between Evangelism and Social Responsibility by Rooting Mission Within the Doctrine of Creation, which I thought was the whole thesis.
Yes.
But it's just a title.
That's the title. Yeah, that's right. It's a long title, but really focused on the image mandate.
Yeah.
And as the foundation. And because that, to me, that resolved that tension that you have between evangelism or the missions mandate, whatever how we phrase it, and just what is our social responsibility, social justice, social action. Was able to flesh that out, and both him and Dr. Livermore, they both helped. So I did major in Dr. Whitmer. He's had a definite imprint on my life.
Yeah. Now, let me just again, I think we probably agree with what I read there, right? With Mike Whitmer had said there. It's not one to the exclusion of the other, but people come to know Christ, and then that transformative, the Spirit transforming them, it comes out in action. It has to come out in action in some way. What does biblical justice look like that may differ from what we see in our society today? What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
Well,
take your time with this.
Take your time.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many different definitions of justice, of social justice. I think of Tony Campolo, who just passed away. I mean, progressive evangelical.
I know he had an influence on your life too.
There was.
But you disagreed with him on certain aspects.
He's a guy that, with his books, I'd be loving it on one hand and then throwing it against the wall. And, I have a weird relationship with my books, and so just they don't last. They don't last that long. But anyways, with he describes social justice as I'm paraphrasing. It's like love fleshed out in policy. He saw it as and I felt like that's kind of a very truncated, a very diminished view of social justice, where it's mainly government support or government redistribution, where the government comes in and is the savior to that. Of course, there's so many different types of strains of that. I mean, and you have people like John Rawls, which I believe has probably the most influence on justice in American thought than anybody, and he really describes justice as fairness, and he's got different ways of, and even people like critical theorists and critical race theorists, they're reacting a lot against that late 20th century justice as fairness, and they said, well, how can you be fair? And then now they go to one extreme over here. So you have that, but then if we look at, I mean, social justice, biblical justice, the church. I mean, man, there's so many resources that the church has. I mean, old Catholic social teaching. I mean, a lot of people, when we think of Catholic social teaching, a lot of us Protestants think of like liberation theology, and that's not true. That's not where they're at. There's a book by Michael Novak that wrote a book called "Social Justice Isn't What You Think It Is." And he talks about social justice being a social virtue where a group of people come together to solve a social problem. And he really talked about just different civic groups coming together and really taking care of the poor or whatever that situation is. Carl F.H. Henry, a 20th century conservative evangelical that a lot of our roots come from, of what is now evangelicalism. I mean, he, first editor of Christianity Today, really talked about social justice as a right ordering of society. And he probably mentioned social justice over 100 times in his writings, going back to the early 60s. And then for me, a definition of social justice, I see it, that it's giving people what they're due. I mean, I kind of go along with Keller a little bit on that, whether it's protection, care, all these different things that are part of that. But it's according to a right standard. Right. And that standard is God's character and his revelation.
Right, and we take it back to the Bible Project video on justice. I think you hit the nail on the head. If you would watch that. Anyway, I want to let Scott kind of chime in here.
No, I'd love to. So I think you can probably use this question as a little bit as a time to flesh out some of the work you do with Urban Transformation Ministries, because I think it's really important, at least for me, to hear about why is biblical justice and teaching about it important to you. Because I feel like I know a lot of people who could go through most of their lives in church and not have to use the words biblical justice and still do a lot of good things or good work. Yeah. So why is it important to you?
I've been a missionary with Urban Transformation Ministries with UTM for 30 years. And what you see on the street, what we experienced living in the neighborhood where we serve, I mean, one of the big things for us is seeing how fatherlessness has affected so many kids. And as we were discipling a lot of these young men and women, since they were kids all the way to adulthood, and seeing how that affected them, some of the traumas that they went through. I have students that were fatherless. Maybe their dad spent a year, or should have spent a year in prison for a nonviolent drug offense, but ends up spending 9 years, and didn't have a defense attorney. That they had one, but didn't give them true justice that we would normally have. So it's something like that I'm like, oh, there are things that are related to this. Yeah, there are a lot of fathers that abandon their kids, but what we've seen, especially in the last 20 years, is even among like single parents, families and stuff, most fathers that are even non-residential fathers, they are doing everything that they can to be with their kids, and sometimes it's the government that gets in the way. Yeah, so there's a lot of different reasons. It's so much more nuanced than just the typical left or all the way to the right. The political solutions. It's a little bit of everything that you see. And so for me, I'm like, yes, evangelism, making disciples is the center of what we do. But if we're going to love our neighbor as ourselves, if we're even going to think of as they're God's image bearers, where they can really, really flourish, having some of these different systems are important as well, including a family that's been sending their kids here to NorthPointe. The Person family, I mean, they've been able to benefit from being able to be part of the NorthPointe community, versus some of the things that they would have gone if they had gone to some of the other institutions. They've been
such a benefit to us too, such a blessing of having them here. Let me just say something as you continue to speak on this. So your mission statement, and goes right along with what you've just been talking about there, and this is where your mission kind of meets the streets, so to speak, is to break the fatherless cycle, to strengthen families in Christ by providing resources, mentoring, and opportunities for growth for those who have come from unstable family environments. What are some examples of that? What are you?
So what we do is a lot of the long-term, we're looking at 10, 15, 20 years, and a lot of it, some people might call it surrogate parenting. Yeah, it's a little bit, but we come alongside the parents, we want to come alongside the family. We don't want to replace the family, because there's some institution, or there's some family dynamics that can be salvaged. If some can't, but some can. A guy that I'm meeting right now with, we call him Big Joe, and Big Joe's about 6'5", 400 pounds. Okay. But his dad was an addict for many, many years, but now he's no longer, and he's reconciled with his father, and his father's a preacher over in Saginaw, and just seeing, went through all sorts of crap. But for us, we want to see these families put back together.
Yeah.
And we the key word in that is in Christ.
Yeah.
In Christ. If you look at Paul, so much of it is in Christ, in Christ, in Christ. That's the secret sauce, if we can call it that. It's Jesus.
Yep. I was reading Tim Keller's book, like I said, on generous justice, and there's an example that he gives of a ministry. Before he talks about this ministry, he says this. He says, doing justice in poor communities includes direct relief, individual development, community development, racial reconciliation, and social reform.
Yeah.
And then he gives an example of this New Song Church in Sandtown in Baltimore, and how
I've
they
been there.
do justice. And it just sounds exactly like what you're talking about with UTM. And
The difference is they have $1 million budget,
Okay.
and they do all the housing and that kind of stuff. Housing isn't necessarily our specialty. We're trying to get out of the housing business because there are places like ICCF that do a really good job. We can do a lot more partnering. What we do best is the life on life type of stuff and walking alongside. And we know our niche. Some things we've learned along the way is what we're really good at, and things that we're like, you know what? There's other people that can do a better job than what we're doing.
And you guys have a bit of an entrepreneurial flair at UTM too, right? So
Yes.
I sometimes think people will think when you think of social reform, kind of when you give the definition of social justice from Tony Campolo, you think okay, we got to go through bureaucratic ways of dealing with problems. But when you meet people who are really at their core entrepreneurs, and when entrepreneurship meets justice, that can be a beautiful little combination. Now, I'd love for you to talk about how you guys do entrepreneurship.
Yeah, the couple that's really on top of this is Davian Pfizer and Rodella Pfizer. And so with both of them, they have businesses that they've started. One that Davian has done is a lot of where he's buying and selling a lot of different things online. And so Davian will take in different students in our ministry. They'll work alongside of him, and they're getting everything ready to be, sold, and they're, taking pictures and doing all these different things for online to sell on Amazon or any of these other platforms. Yeah. But at the same time, what he's doing is he's pouring his life into him. He's asking him questions about God, asking him questions about what's going on in life, challenging him, a lot of the students, to think way ahead in the future, and really being that father figure to a lot of these young men. And then Rodella does the same thing. She has an ice shaving business. So they'll go and do all these different parties, but they'll bring a few students along. They're teaching a skill. They're teaching, because these students, they're watching every modeling is the most powerful avenue. It's an internship in a way, but it's at a very grassroots level. That's happening. But it exposes our students to, they can make money. Because, for Davian, I remember when he was 17, actually maybe before that, he thought the only thing that he could do in our neighborhood was sell drugs. Yeah. And that's the only thing that he was exposed to. And so now he's an entrepreneurial evangelist. And both of them are.
Yeah. Anyway, I think coming back to, and maybe we've made a kind of connection here, because I know with the big picture you're always looking for internships, and maybe something that we can
we've done a little bit.
You've done a little bit before.
Well, I think what's amazing is a lot of times when I walk into NorthPointe and I see some of the students that God's put in front of me, you kind of lose your missional hat, and you kind of, sometimes you can, and you kind of say okay, I'm equipping these students to go out and do this work, but you don't realize the work isn't done yet. I got some work to do here still to do the discipleship work. And so what's really nice about the Big Picture Learning Program is I've gotten to send students to you to learn from. Remind me of who you just said, from Davian. And so he's really blessed our program and some of the students we've worked with. I got a question though. When we talk about social justice, especially, and the work you're doing at UTM, the work you do at UTM is very personal. It is life on life. And a lot of people might be able to safely categorize that as evangelism, just the one side of the coin. It's just maybe a very involved evangelism. But there is a sense that the other side, to flip it back to the other side of the coin, where you guys are also thinking systemically. And I just want to ask you a question to flesh out what does biblical justice have to do with systems? And again, this is your opportunity to tell stories if you want. For example, something like systemic racism, which is a hot potato. Unfortunately, it's hard to talk about if you don't have people of some baseline understanding of what justice means. But I would love for you to just talk about what does this have to do with systems?
So we're talking about injustices. Racial injustice, economic injustice. So we've got to root it in the doctrine of sin. So what I see is you have individual sin, you have systemic sin. The two are constantly feeding into each other. If you look at the doctrine of total depravity, everything that it's not about how bad you are. I mean, that's how people think of depravity. It's that every part of our nature is touched by sin. Sinful people create institutions that are sinful, and those institutions come back to affect the sinful people that are part of those systems. And so you're talking about different racial injustices. For many years, again, a lot of my students would get followed at a Myers, at a mall. And they're following the black kids. In fact, I had white kids that grew up in the hood who, when they knew that all these black kids were being followed, they would go off and steal stuff at the mall because they knew that they were following all the black kids. And then we knew of things like that was taking place. Right now, I often use how people racialize things. That's because I mean, when we talk about racism, that's kind of like right now the scarlet R. You don't want to be labeled as a racist, and because it's been
so overused, and again, that poisoning the well right away.
If everything is racism, then nothing is racist. Right. At the same time, I hear DEI hires all the time. If you're automatically assuming that a person does not have those skills, they got in that position because of the color of their skin, they are racializing that situation. But you're talking like the criminal justice system. I mean, that's huge. I mean, in how some of the unfairness. Now, can I just also say, with the criminal justice system, there's definitely been racialized, but also the poor in general, white poor, have been discriminated as well. Our criminal justice system is geared for the middle class and the rich. Yes, there's definitely some racial things that have happened that lead to that, but it's also people that are poor as well. So I want to make sure that it's a lot more nuanced than what we see, and there's been a lot of progress that have been made. I mean, if you go back to the '60s, I mean,
night and day difference.
If you've gone to Chicago, the Dan Ryan
Freeway
Express, they busted down two prominent black neighborhoods, and there were some whites and some Hispanics that were part of that too, to build that highway that destroyed those communities that had stores, all these different things that were going on. We drive that all the time when we go to Chicago, and white people and Hispanics, they were able to go to the suburbs. Black folks weren't. Many of them, not all of them, many of them had the only place they had housing were the housing projects. So they're forced into those different segregation. Those it isn't that way how it is now, but there is still some different racial things that people will.
I think about, like, I haven't met many people in my life who would disagree with the statement that there are historical determinants to the outcomes of black and brown people in America, like net outcomes. So I'm not talking individual basis, net outcomes. So most people don't disagree that there was a problem that led to our current situation. Most people disagree with, so what do we do about it now? So we have a lot of believers in that there is injustice systemically in the United States. Most people don't actually agree with the core tenets there. It's really just like, okay, so what do we do with it? And a lot of people would say it's actually best not to really make that the central talking point. It's actually best to focus elsewhere. And then some people say, we need to talk about this. Put it in the middle of the room. Everybody has to gather around this topic.
Can I just say, until Joel writes his book, I just want to suggest Tim Keller, Generous Justice, How God's Grace Makes Us Just. And I think that, he talks about a lot of that too. But anyway, go ahead with your point.
So I'm a teacher now. And sorry, you can go back to a previous question if you want.
No, that's fine. No, I love it.
I'm sitting here thinking of how do I talk about this content, biblical justice content, in a way that isn't like a political wedge, that doesn't make people run away and think that I'm prescribing a solution to the problem, but where I can talk about the problems. And I'm wondering, in your experience, because you swim in a lot of waters with a lot of different people who have a lot of different beliefs on this, a lot of political persuasions. How do you talk about this, or what do you emphasize in the conversations that make people gather around and talk about it in a reasonable way?
That's a challenge.
I mean, if you look at my my Facebook profile, I mean, I have people. Half the people are from the left. Half of the people are from the right. I mean, if you're looking at a political spectrum, people of color, 1/3, half black, Hispanic, white. So I have a little of everything. I'm always looking to build common ground. I've seen a lot of millennials that grew up, in those conservative Christian, where they've gone to the left, and really they've gone because of how abortion and LGBTQ are the two things of why. When it comes to abortion, I'm pro-life all the way from the womb to the tomb. I say that whole care is very important to us. There have been several students that almost aborted their children. Part of it also is, I'm dealing with some people that disagree with me. There's some Christians that that are pro-choice Christians, and so they'll be saying, well, Jesus didn't say anything about abortion, or the Bible doesn't. And so I was like, let's go back to the Didache, and I'm going back to a lot of the original sources and a lot of different things. I'm talking about even Emperor Constantine outlawing abortion, and then basically making sure that people aren't going to be the poor aren't going to be able to expose their kids for child exposure or abortions. So he's feeding them. And the church is administrating. I says the church has always been doing this kind of stuff. But what I do try to do is I build that commonality. If I'm dealing with churches that come from on the right, I'm going to be talking about individual responsibility and all these different things. I've really enjoyed some of the rural churches because they understand, because they're dealing with rural poverty. And so I can really build an easier commonality with them because they have relationships with the poor. Now there's some cross-cultural things but it's through relationships. It's through the relationships that we have. That's the key with all this. And
this is a place where we need to wrap it up here. But
yes, sorry.
No. We're right on time here with this. But this is where I want to bring it to. The church needs to step up. There's no doubt about that. And there are ministries like yours that are out there that desperately need the church to step up.
Yes.
Okay? So what is it that we can do? What is it that a person watching or listening out there can do to partner with UTM and the redemptive work that you're doing for the kingdom? What can they do?
When we get volunteers, when we talk to volunteers, we're going to ask them the different skills that they have, whether it's their vocational or whatever. If a person has music, that's something that they can offer to help, because we have kids that are musicians. If a person that's educated, they can help tutor. We can tailor make our life on life towards tutoring. This is all part of that social capital. The church is has the greatest depository social capital, according to Bob Putnam, who's wrote the book on social capital. And so utilizing those skills to help entrepreneurial, coming alongside a retired man, taking a student 12, who's 12, 13 to rake their leaves but teaching them how to do it too, coming alongside of them. Those type of, there's different ways for us. You have 3 different ways of being a mentor. We have one way is just that life on life mentor that's going to be there all the time. We have equipping mentors that we and it might only be for a certain time. One of our volunteers, he's a plumber, and he hired one of our students for about a year and a half, taught him a plumbing skill. Now, the student is going through a lot. He's not working with them right now, but the student has a skill
Right.
that he's going to be able to go back to, and then utilizing those opportunities, to share Jesus, to be a friend, to listen, just being a listener. That's all part of that. And then also we have a connecting mentor. And this is probably the easiest way, but for some of our students, they have someone that they get to know and that they communicate back and forth with. He's going to have to go to college or a trade school or something like that. Having someone that they build a relationship to help them put out it for a resume, that, this person is solid. Then utilizing those networks of relationships that are in the middle class or upper middle class have, that the poor or those that are in our community that we're reaching out to, most of we don't have those connections that they might have. So,
so you're talking businesses, you're talking individuals that can do that.
Yes,
and financially supporting UTM as a way of doing that.
We definitely need financial support to do all this kind of stuff, because we're all life on life. We don't have the sexy programs where we have 100 some kids that really bring in the money, because we're doing life on life. So if you go online, utmgr.org/donate, you can see, different
and
ways
we're going to put a place where that people can access that too.
Yes.
So once we're finished with the podcast here. Anything else?
No, I'm just grateful that you came on here. I feel like we could make this podcast a 5-hour long one. Maybe
we
next
could
episode.
have. We could have.
If you want a part 2, and come back on different things, I'll do part 2 too.
All right. Well, I think we did get to the point.
Yeah.
Which that's us. We're out. It's glad to have you guys with us. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Point. I'm your producer, Alex Sigma. And if you enjoyed the episode, be sure to rate us on Spotify and share this podcast with others. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube or follow us on Spotify. We'll see you on the next episode.